Our own Howard Young is talking today, and he was a captain in the Navy, and you can't really hold that against him. I mean, I guess you can.
Some of us can.
Yeah, some of us can. Naval aviator and test pilot, 2 Vietnam combat tours, 20 years in the cockpit as a fighter pilot. Squadron command and air wing command, that's significant. Elementary, middle school teacher, math, science, history. Got private and commercial pilot ratings, and Experimental Aircraft Association member, and 200 plus Young Eagle introductory flights. With that, Howard Young.
Good morning. So shout out to Dudley for putting this thing together in a format that's compatible with the standards of the museum. I can remember how to push these buttons, will be good. Okay, so we're going to talk about flying the Ford. Not this Ford. Although I like the lettering on the back. It's like in the car. But the F4D Skyray, and that's how it got its name. F4D shortened Ford.
Oh.
And so I was in this particular squadron. It was the only Navy squadron assigned operationally to the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, during the Cold War. And we're based right over here at North Island. And you can see that underneath there, Coronado and North Island. And it's one of our birds.
What year was that picture?
That picture could have been anywhere from 1958 to 1960, probably.
Okay. 58 to 60?
Yeah, I was in the squadron from 1961 to 1963, and we decommissioned it. So here's a 3-view drawing of the airplane, fairly unique at delta wing, platform, single seat, single engine, afterburner. We'll get into that a little bit more. Skyray derived its name from one of these manta rays because of the shape of the wing. Cutaway view of it. So all the fuel was located in the fuselage, except here's an outline of a 300-gallon drop tank, which we carried because there was very little fuel internally. Big engine took up most of the space in there. 20-millimeter cannons in the wings. Rocket pods. This was like a big bomb, but it was a navigation package because there wasn't enough room in the airplane to put all the electronics because they kept adding stuff to it. So the background of the development of this airplane is interesting. It's a fellow by the name of Dr. Alexander Lippisch. Spent a lot of time in study on delta wing design. It had certain advantages. It had high lift and it was swept back sufficiently so you could get high speed out of it. So good high altitude performance with that particular design if they could perfect it. And so right after VE Day, 2 Douglas Aircraft Company engineers visited Dr. Lippisch in Paris. He was intern there, and their boss was Ed Heinemann, the very famous Douglas chief engineer who designed a lot of military airplanes, starting back in World War II. And so in 1947, the Cold War starting to heat up to the point where, hey, we got to come up with an airplane that will intercept and destroy an enemy bomber traveling at 500 knots at 40,000 feet, and we got to get to him at least by 100 miles so he doesn't become a threat to our fleet, our carrier task forces. And so Heinemann and Jack Northrop, Northrop Company, collaborated on this and to meet that spec. So they designed the airplane, and its first flight was in 1951, early 51, and it was fraught with problems. It was underpowered. It had a Allison J35 engine in it with a puny little afterburner. It probably generated about 7,000 pounds of thrust. And it had significant stability and control problems. The Douglas test pilot landed it and said, "I'm never going to fly this airplane again." And he didn't. He let other people fly it, but sufficiently spooked him that he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Here's Dr. Lippisch, and one of his designs was the German rocket interceptor, Me-163, I believe it was. So it's sort of a delta wing. It has no horizontal tail surfaces, so it's part of his design philosophy. Ed Heinemann was a recipient of the Collier Trophy for the greatest achievement in aeronautics in America in 1953 for the F-4D design. He shared that trophy with Dutch Kindleberger of North America, who got it for the Super Sabre. So even with improvements, now, the first flight in 1951, hey, this is a great performing airplane. We'll talk about some of the records that it set. But even when it was introduced to the fleet, and that took 5 years, we're talking about a marginally stable, high workload airplane that had a tuck under pitch, nose down pitch at about 0.96 Mach. They never could get rid of that. They had something called a transonic trim compensator, which was supposed to anticipate that and program in some nose up trim to compensate. Well, when I got to the squadron, they had all those things wired off because they didn't work. But the delta wing did give it its speed, great maneuverability, particularly at high altitude and high lift, so it could really climb fast. So, the goal was to achieve that design spec that I just mentioned earlier. The flight controls consisted of, and I'll show you this, but just to mention them, elevons on the back of the wing, and they work like this for pitch, nose up, nose down, and they work like this for roll. It had a conventional rudder, no flaps to slow it down for landing, and it had aerodynamically operated slats on the leading edge to give the wing a little bit more curvature, a little bit more camber, a little bit more lift at slow speeds, and they just came out on their own. They had rollers on them, and they just dropped down when you got slow enough, and when you sped up, they would retract. Very simple, but effective. I debated long and hard before I decided to put this in there, but it's an interesting, I think an important point for the flying qualities of this airplane because of its delta wing. So I'll go through this fairly quickly, not to bore you or lose your train of thought. So in the landing configuration, the airplane was cocked up like this. Why is that? Well, lift depends on two things: how fast the air is flowing over the wings and the angle of attack. And you trade off one for the other. So you'll see an airplane in high-speed flight, its angle of attack is low, and you slow it down, you're losing velocity, but you're gaining lift because of the increased angle of attack on the wing. So what is the angle of attack? So if I take, a straight line between the trailing and the leading edge of the wing and project that out that way, and then I take the flight path, so the airplane is flying along this way, so it's moving in that direction. So you have a relative wind going over the wing this way, right? And so that angle is the angle of attack. So you increase the angle of attack and you increase lift, right? Up to a point. If you increase it too much, the air flowing over the top of the wing can't make that turn. You know? It's too tight, it spins out, you get turbulent flow, and then you lose your lift. So the total lift on the wing, let's say it's flying, you're not stalled, is perpendicular to the wing chord, so that way. But the lift that's keeping the airplane in the air, we'll call it effective lift, has got to be exactly equal and opposite to the airplane's weight. And the airplane's weight is always what? Straight down, going to the center of the earth. So these have to be equal and opposite. And so as the angle of attack increases, the total lift vector is going to move back this way, right? So part of it is the effective lift, which you have to keep it flying. And the other part here, I've got this in red, is something you don't like. It's called induced drag or drag due to lift. So you can see as the angle of attack, alpha increases, your induced drag is going to go up. And so let's say you're not familiar with flying this particular kind of an airplane, and you say, oh, I'm getting a little bit low, I'm in the landing pattern, I'm getting a little bit low, I'm just going to raise the nose a little bit and get back on the glide path. Well, all you're really doing there is increasing your induced drag, and what's going to happen, the airplane's going to slow down, and it's going to start to settle because you don't have enough lift. And so what you had to do in this airplane to compensate for that is power. You didn't fool around with the control stick very much, it was all power. And which was good because you're getting some of your thrust, you know, with this angle like this, lifting it up. So if you didn't come on with that power soon enough, you could get yourself what we used to call behind the power curve. In the classic example, there was a movie of it, the saber dance that we were talking about recently. You saw that F-100 Super Saber just off the runway going like this. And he had so much induced drag, there wasn't enough thrust to pull him out of it. And it was a tragic accident. So enough on that.
Left hand.
So, even though it didn't have its final engine, it did achieve some significant records. October 1953, 3 kilometers, 753 miles an hour. 100 kilometer close course, 728. And then later, with the big engine, we'll talk about the engine, it achieved the world time to climb record, 50,000 feet, 2 minutes and 36 seconds. Even now, that's impressive. You get up there that quickly. The J-35 underpowered, and they said, well, we got the J-40 coming along, let's put that in there. And it had more thrust, but it was extremely unreliable. And that was a Westinghouse product. And so, unsuitable for service use. Ed Heinemann and all his brilliance knew that the Pratt & Whitney J57 was coming along, and it was going to have significant improvement in its power. And so he very wisely designed the fuselage to accommodate that bigger engine. And they put that in there, and only because of that engine did we get an airplane that was good enough for production. So we got the airplane, and it's being introduced into the fleet. And then the Navy and people that decide how we counter the threats of the day. So, you know, we got to be able to shoot down enemy bombers in bad weather and at night, and they're going to have their lights off. So we got to put an air intercept radar, and they were designing those, and they were coming along. at that time. And so they put in a radar fire control system. And which was good, and it worked. But, so let's talk about this one here. There's just a video clip of the airplane, about a minute and a half.
What was the Mach on the airplane?
0.96. You could make it go supersonic. Oh. So this guy's wearing a life vest, and they had a, I'll talk about the seat. So the elevons are moving there. The pitch trimmers control the pitch trim, nose up and nose down. This is an airplane from our squadron. I'll talk about the squadron in a little bit. I got through it. I thought better than try to pause it. So these are the components that they added to the airplane to give it its all-weather capability. So the radar scope, the radar up in the nose, controls here, armament panel there, optical gun sight there, which it took inputs from the radar, and how you control the radar and lock on and acquisition and all that. And so it made an already crowded cockpit even more crowded. This is a view of the radar control. So you could scan the radar back and forth automatically, and you could select different ranges all the way out to 200 miles. But if you're looking for a target to acquire, you had two ranges, a 24-mile range and a 12-mile range. And depending on where you saw the target on the radars, would tell you which range value to select. And you could control the antenna with this handle here on the side, and you could control the up and down with a little thumb wheel there. And underneath it there was a switch, and you depress that, and you use that to lock on the target. So you're playing with that with your left hand while you're flying the plane with your right hand. And autopilot, no autopilot. They couldn't design an autopilot to manage the relative instability of it.
So was this somewhere between the Super Sabre and the 100, or where does it fit in there?
So the Super Sabre, I don't know when the first flight of the Super Sabre was. Do you know? First flight?
I'd say like 54, but I'm not real sure.
So the Super Sabre came along a little bit afterwards. It took some of the low altitude speed records from the F4D. I think they got up to about 800.
Yeah, it had the same engine, J57.
They had a J57, yeah. And the reason why they did those speed records on a very hot day in the desert was to be able to push the speed of sound up, so that if you hit that wall of the sound barrier, the shock wave that you get, you're not going to have enough to accelerate through it. So they got the day as hot as they could get it to make that record. Yeah, so 0.96 was the fastest it would go in level flight, but it could climb at 0.96. You could get the Ford to go supersonic. What you had to do is get up to about 35,000 feet, drop the nose about 20 degrees, and go into burner. And you could squeak out about 1.05 after this tuck under buck. um, kept you from accelerating too much. But, you know, there was no point in doing that. It would just say, well, yeah, it'll go supersonic, and burn up a bunch of gas. We only carried 8,000 pounds of fuel, 4,000 internally, and then 200-300 gallon drop tanks brought it up to about 8,000. But in full burner, you were burning about 600 pounds a minute. So you could run that airplane out of fuel if you weren't judicious in how you manage your fuel. It's a busy, cramped cockpit. Navigation controls on the right side, and then your engine controls and your radar controls on the left side. This is the only photo I could find of a cockpit. It's pretty decrepit, but you know, you got to remember this airplane existed many years ago. So, as part of your training, they blindfold you, and you had to be able to touch every knob and instrument and name it correctly. So we got very familiar. I spent a lot of time in the cockpit getting ready to my first flight.
They weren't very far away.
They're all, yeah, a little guy like me fit nicely in there. And then my next plane after the Ford was the F4 Phantom. And I'm saying, look at this. It was, the first flight of the Ford was in '51. The first flight of the F4 Phantom was '58. So 7 years. It's remarkable how rapidly and you know how much the technology had changed in that very short period of time. A tribute to American and design ingenuity. So anyway, I got my wings and reported to VFAW3, my first squadron. You know, I made a mistake with that. That's March of 1961 is when I got there. We were the only Navy squadron under NORAD control, but we always beat out the Air Force.
Oh, come on.
And all our competitions. We got all these awards, you know, the operational readiness inspection. NORAD was divided.
Was it being scored by the Navy?
No, by NORAD headquarters. So, and most of these awards had already been presented by the time I got to the squadron, so it was a well-established reputation. So NORAD was divided into 4 regions, and we were the Western region. It was a big squadron, 30 aircraft, 32 pilots, all highly experienced. I was what they call a nugget. And we were divided into 4 flights, 8 pilots each, Alpha, Bravo, Delta, Charlie and Delta. I was in Alpha flight. A squadron patch. There's the flight line at North Island. So some of the airplanes on the ramp, some of our 30 airplanes. So first flight was interesting, right off of runway 18 here at North Island. And we had an operational flight trainer, a simulator, you know, we learned emergency procedures and all that. It didn't have a motion base on it, but it pretty well qualified you for actually getting in the cockpit and taking off. But the first thing that I noticed when I took off was the airplane started to slip around and yaw and significantly, and they said, well, you're gonna feel that, and you can counteract it with rudder, but what it is the landing gear doors will open, The wheels will come up and close, but they do that independently. They're not synchronized. So one will come up, and then a few seconds later, the other one will do the same thing, and so you're going to get a yaw this way, and then a yaw this way, and after they're up and locked, you're good to go. But it got my attention. And we would take off, and we'd always go out as a section of 2 airplanes, and we'd practice radar intercepts against each other. Not much air combat maneuvering. You know, we had those drop tanks on, and we had all the missiles and things externally. I'll talk to you about that. But we just ran intercepts against each other. There were several different modes. You could do a lead collision intercept to launch rockets against an enemy target, or we could do a lead pursuit intercept to convert to the rear quarter for a sidewinder shot, or get in close enough. Guns, we had our 20mm cannon, and so that's what we spent most of the time doing. We always flew instrument flight procedures, and we always came back and landed at North Island on runway 29 with the ground control approach, precision approach radar, and that was SOP. And so when it was time to become qualified, we would set up for launch what we call a practice scramble. So a scramble was launching, you'd be in full flight gear in the ready room, and they'd sound a klaxon. This would all be controlled by for the practice of it, the Air Force did radar site on Mount Laguna. Now I've got a question for you, and if anybody can answer it, because I've forgotten it. But if anybody can answer this question, there's a prize. What was the radio call sign of the radar site in Mount Laguna during the Cold War in the early 60s there? I can't remember what it was. And I Googled it, got some bad names. I even went to AI to get the name. Got the wrong name. But if somebody gets it, I'll remember it. There's a prize if you get it. First one to get it. Anyway, so we were required to be airborne in 5 minutes from the ready room, which was maybe about 200 feet from where the airplanes were parked. And we'd go out ahead of time to set the airplane up for the launch. So we'd turn it up, we'd run the radar, we'd practice locking on. The Coronado Islands out there was a good target, and we'd make sure the radar worked, locking onto the islands. Everything all ready to go. Kept our helmet in there, and we pre-flighted the airplane. And so all we had to do was, when we got the signal to launch it, run out there, strap in. A plane captain would help us strap in. They would start the ground power cart. It would start pumping air into the compressor of the engine. And so when you sat down in there, you could look at the RPM gauge, and you had about 8%. And then he would pull the safety pin out of the ejection seat, take the ladder away, and give you the turn up. All you had to do was, at that point, hit the igniters, start the engine, and start taxiing. And we got automatic takeoff clearance from the tower. You just call them up and said, ready to launch, Roger, cleared for takeoff, runway 18. So we got to be pretty good at it. I could get airborne in under 3 minutes from the ready room. The only last thing they had to do was they had to pull the safety pins out of the rockets and the missiles. And they had an ordnance crew just at the approach into the runway that would pull those out. And so, yeah, we just took turns, bumping heads, we called it, with each other. Taking turns being the target and being the interceptor. And before you got fully qualified, the final exam was live rocket firing. And we had a towed target called a Delmar. I think it was just made out of styrofoam, painted red with a plastic covering. It had a big radar reflector in there so you could see it on the radar scope. And one of our birds would tow it. And they had this apparatus under the wing and driven by this propeller, air-driven. And they would extend it out on a wire, and it'd go out about 2,000 feet behind the tow plane. So here's a picture of our two birds. We always flew sections of two on alert. So you got the ground power starter hooked up to it. You had a sentry out here. Make sure nobody got close to those airplanes except the pilots. Lanyard for the safety wires for the ejection seat. I'll show you some more of the armament configuration here. Like I said, we always flew flights of two. So 2 300-gallon external fuel tanks, you could drop them if you had to. 2 sidewinders, 2.75-inch folding pin rocket pods. We had 2 different sizes. We had 10 rockets per pod in the smaller one and 19 shots in the big fatter one. 4-wing mounted 20mm. The nav pack on the fuselage center line, because when they put all that radar stuff in there, you didn't have any room inside the airplane for all that extra gear. Folding fins would pop out after they cleared the rocket pod housing. So here are the rocket pods, the drop tanks, the nav pack down there, and the 2 sidewinders. Here's a good view of the leading edge slats. Another view, the view of the pitch trimmers and yellow bonds.
The 20mm was not a Gatling gun, right? It was just straight.
Say that again?
The 20mm was not a Gatling gun. It was just
Oh, no.
straight.
Before Gatling came along. The modern one. The ones they use in the Mexican War.
They had a little guy down there.
Yeah.
Feeding the bullets.
We had a hamster that we trained to turn that. So this is the best of all worlds. Lieutenant junior grade, my big job was squadron pilot. Not much paperwork, not much responsibility, just go out and fly. I regard that as the peak of my military career. Now comes a significant part of history, the role that we played in the Cold War. So in this, we were told that the Soviets had put MiG-21 fighters in the SAM batteries down in Cuba. So the first thing that happened was, well, we're going to send the Navy down there because there's a naval air station down there in Key West, Boca Chica Key. And so we sent a detachment. And we'd stay down there for about 2 months. And we'd sequence through the flights. So Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. We'd go down there. We took four airplanes down there. And all of our pilots, 8 pilots. And they had a trailer for us. And they'd bring us food from the mess hall, hot food and everything. We had some bunks, and we had a little control center, where we could communicate with the ground control agency. And I remember the name of that one. That was an Air Force GCI site on base. It was called Tarpon.
Was that during the Cuban Missile Crisis or for an extended period?
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
So we got down there mid-1962. And it was a very exciting flying down there. So as I said, we had 2 fighters manned up for the launch, and we'd launch, go on our practice launches. In my flight, I was a junior guy, and the flight leader thought that I should learn how to become a flight leader. And he says that you're going to lead all the flights, young, and I'll be in trail. In case something happens and we need to go guns hot or missiles hot, you break off and we can do what we have to do to eliminate the threat. And so, and I was pretty fast on getting into the air anyway, so I would take off first and he'd follow. And so, and a lot of this happened at night. And flying out of Key West at night was all instruments, because unless there was a moon, there was no horizon. So it was just dark. But we were very accomplished in flying instruments. So that, that wasn't a particular challenge. But we started to get actual scrambles while we were there. If it was going to be a practice scramble, they'd call us up and say, we're going to launch you in 10 minutes on a training mission. And so we'd saunter out to the airplane and strap in and be all ready to go. We didn't need to practice running out of the trailer and falling down in the dark and all that stuff. So I'll never forget our first actual scramble. The klaxon sounded, and it was horrible, loud noise, I mean, it would stop your heart. What's this? It's a real one. Your heart's beating fast, you jump in, and you take off, and you switch to the GCI site, and they vector you in on a target. And these targets will be penetrating into the Air Defense Identification Zone, abbreviation ADIZ, which everybody had to be identified before you hit that line. And if you were not within your established flight parameters, off course, off altitude, off heading, whatever, off time that you had on a flight plan, or if you had no flight plan, we got the word to scramble. And so airliners off course, typically Aerodynamics de Mexico, from the Yucatan Peninsula, crossing the Gulf, going into Miami, and it'd be way off, and we get launched out. So, and I had to lead, and a lot of this was done at night. And so, what we had to do was to fly alongside, close formation, and identify them, and get their tail numbers, and report that back to Tarpon. And once we got that information, we were released. It's an airliner. It's a 707, or it's a de Havilland Comet, one of the very first jet airliners, a few other types. And so the procedure was, we turn our lights off so that they couldn't tell we were there, and lock them up on the radar, make an in-trail rendezvous on the radar, get up even with them. And then, so how are we going to get their side number? Well, we had a 5-cell flashlight, 5 D cells, it's about that big. And the face of it, where the bulb was about that big around. And so we had a sponge rubber cylindrical cover on that lens. And so flying the airplane with your right hand, and I'd be on the right side of the airliner, take this flashlight, slap it up against the side of the canopy, so that no light would feed back inside and blind you. So that's why you had that rubber muff on there, and then turn it on and then look around and see where the side number was. And then, you know, I'm starting to fall back, put it down, adjust the throttle, put it back up, and you get the numbers, you know, you call out the numbers. And so, okay, that's good, you're released. And so that's where the fun really started, so put that away. And I'll turn all my lights on now. And then people start looking out the window and seeing these lights up there, you know. And I remember, like, on a couple of occasions, there was a face in every window looking at me. And I said, oh, this is nice.
Yeah.
But I was far enough back so that the pilots couldn't see me. Until I lit the burner, you got about a 15-foot long flame coming out of the back. You know, blue-orange flame. And then you start walking away from them. And then that's when the pilots would see you. And it was good because they knew they'd been intercepted. You know, they're bad, and so they had to know that. You know, pull up, you know, accelerate out. And yeah, and then low and slow. So one night we're out on an actual scramble, and the target was, all I could say was he's low and slow. And so I rotated the antenna down, and those were all pulse radars, and so you always got a lot of C clutter when you pointed the antenna down. So we had to reduce the gain. All that was done manually. You know, there was no sophisticated computers to detect all that and make the correction. So you turn the gain down and then work on that elevation control, and lo and behold, here was the target. And I lock onto it. He's way down there. And so, and he's really slow. And so, going to intercept him, going to get in trail and walk up to him and see what's going on. So this was like a Cessna 172 or something like that, maybe doing 110 knots at most. And he was at 500 feet. Well, I couldn't fly that slow, but I could kind of walk by him. And so I did what I could, you know. I figured the overtake rate and all that on the radar, and it gave you your closing velocity. And you could make a very good rendezvous using the radar until you got close enough to visually see something. In this case, what I saw was the exhaust flames coming out of the engine exhaust. And so I got up alongside of him, you know, and I said, I gotta do this fast. Going by him, and I got the flashlight out with this hand. And I get his numbers, you know, and I report it, and, you know, just keep on going. And then lit the burner. Make sure you understood I was there. So we figured he had no flight plans. So our assumption was he was probably a drug runner. Going to some little bitty airfield, you know, one of the Keys. There are other night flying challenges. Any pilots in here that ever got vertigo?
How about everybody?
Be honest, yeah. So we took up one that it's on a practice bump heads, you know, down in Key West. And I'm flying along, and I look out the side. Oh my gosh, I'm upside down. This airplane is flying upside down, you know. And you talk about the heart palpitating, you know, and hyperventilation. I said, my God. You know, and I looked at the instruments. I said, they're lying to me. I'm upside down. I forced myself to look up. What was I looking at? I was looking at stars. right? So I'm upside down. I look up and I said, wait. There's some stars. And there's some stars. I'm not upside down. So what it was there was a huge shrimp fishing industry in Key West. And these were all the shrimp boats, and they had a white masthead light. And there were hundreds of them out there. So, you know, no horizon, dark ocean, and all these lights. And so that was a severe case of vertigo from an optical illusion. I remember that like it was yesterday. Okay, now Cuban Missile Crisis, October '62. So we were all called to a meeting in the big conference room of the radar ground control site there on the base. I got to finish this thing up. And they said, we're going to give you an interim top secret clearance because what we've got to tell you is pretty heavy duty. So we raised our hand and signed something. We go in there. Well, wait, so this is a Cuban MiG-21 flown by Soviet pilots. So we went into the room there and they showed us this photograph. And it's not very good quality. But what it was the intermediate range ballistic missile launch site that the Soviets had sent to Cuba. And they were in the process of making them operational. You know, all the facilities surrounding it, the actual launch pads and everything. This is, the Soviets are prepared for World War III. And they got missiles that can go 1,500 miles into North America. So we're on high alert. And we're going to augment all these forces down here in Key West, and that's going to happen immediately. And you're not to talk to anybody about this. So we'll walk out there, and I wasn't on duty, it was just a regular work day. So we got into the car that we had. Somebody bought it for $50. It was a Ford that you could see the street through the floorboards. We used that to go out on Liberty after work. But anyway, we got into the old Ford, four of us, went back and we were staying at the Holiday Inn. And I'm walking through the foyer of the Holiday Inn, you know, they have these newsstands in the entrance there to these places. And here was the latest flash copy of the Miami Herald with this exact same photograph.
Top secret.
Well, you know, so much for top secret. So we became Fortress Key West. The Air Force came down from Homestead in their F-104s. You know, these guys were the best of the best, right? Because they had the fastest airplane. And so they introduced themselves by a division flying supersonically as they flew into the break. He was boom, boom. Oh, hey, let's go outside, see what's going on. And so the four planes landed. The first one went off the end of the runway. The second one rolled off the side of the runway. And the last two figured out that, well, we better be careful. We landed okay. And then the Navy brought their brand new Phantoms in. And they put another trailer next to us, you know. And now they were going to really you know, let us know who could do this job properly because of our superior airplane. And so, okay, well, we'll let you do some practice scrambles. We told them our procedures and everything. And then we all set out with great interest watching them do their first practice scramble. Horn sounded, they all ran out there in the two airplanes. The first one taxied out of the chops in about 18 minutes. It was a learning experience for them. They didn't brag too much after that about what they did. So here's Key West, and the base was here. The MiGs were based down here, San Antonio de los Baños. Their missile site was somewhere in this area here. So I'll never forget, and the rule was that we were not allowed, this is 90 miles from here to here, we were not allowed to go south of the latitude 24 north, unless we were in hot pursuit. And we'd have to get permission to do that. Or, if we'd been fired upon and we were chasing them, then we were clear to do that. So I'll never forget that we got an active scramble one day, got under radar control, and yeah, we got bandits heading up north of Cuba, 2 of them, and so we started heading south, and I'm saying that so we think they're bandits, we think they're hostile. And if they clear 24 north, you're cleared in hot. And now you talk about my heart beating. I'm saying, 23 years old, I'm going to kill a MiG. and this is, it wasn't fear, it was excitement, and the hunger for the kill, I guess you might want to call it. That's what we were trained for, right? So I got my hands on the switch and I'm ready to go. Now I got to get them on radar. Easy peasy. Pick them right up, Yeah, I'm locking on. I told my flight lead, who was now my wingman, even though he was senior to me, I said, I got the one on the left. And then, I'll lock the one on the right, So the MiGs went up this way, got you here, turned around and accelerated. And that was the end of that. Great disappointment. But it took me about 10 minutes to get my heart rate back down to normal. When we first started out, the video I showed you had the pilot coming out with a life vest on. Well, that's because we had a seat that was made by Douglas, the airplane manufacturer, that was only good to about 200 feet. And it did not have 0 ground level ejection capability. But then the Navy started buying seats from the British manufacturer, Martin Baker, and those seats were installed, which did give us a bona fide 0. And so we did practice our ejection and over water survival procedures, considering that we may have to be going to combat down there. So this is, basically how the seat worked. You get fired out, and an extractor drove, and a stabilizing drove, and then if you were above 10,000 feet, you'd stay in the seat until you got down to 10,000 feet, and a barometric device would automatically release you from the seat and open your parachute. So that was a big improvement. And they put that in all. Did they have Martin Baker in the F-100 too? Yeah. I think all the tactical jets ended up with Martin Baker. This is our Alpha flight down in Key West. I think all these boys are pretty well gone now. I don't know about this one. So we had torso suits. You probably don't recognize me. A few changes over the years. We had 38 pistols, a torso suit, a life vest, all integrated there. And we could actually strap it in faster with the Martin Baker than we could with the old seat. A for Alpha Flight. These were some of the awards that we got. Top Gun, C&O Safety Award. All of the regional awards. Beat out all Air Force squadrons. So, that's it. There you go.
Well done.
Questions for Howard?
Was there a Nike site in San Diego?
I don't know.
I was just wondering, I know where the site is. We have a cabin in Mount Laguna. I've been up to that site. It was really kind of cool. It's all gone now. They took it out.
Yeah. So, in addition to all the airplanes they put down there, I mean, they had airplanes on the taxiways down in Key West. Key West was a fortress. We had to wear our uniform anywhere we went, even in town. The beach, big tourist attraction, the beach down there in Key West was off limits for recreation tourists. They had Hawk missile batteries on that beach. So we were on a wartime footing, and everybody knows who's studied the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We probably that was the closest point to becoming a hot war, the Cold War becoming a hot war throughout that whole period of time. And we were there to live it. And, we were too busy to be scared, but it was a scary time. Peace.
Was there always two of you together? Were you always flying in pairs?
Always flew in pairs, yeah.
Perhaps because you were there, the commies backed off. And, well, could be, you know. You never know.
Well, I appreciate that compliment coming from Air Force. Yeah, Chuck?
Well, sorry, go ahead. Where did you fly after the F-4D?
So we decommissioned the squadron in March of '63. That we're the last squadron, Navy squadron, to fly them because it was becoming obsolete. A few utility squadrons flew them, you know, for target services, but the Phantom was being introduced. And so it went over to Miramar, which was a naval air station then, as you all know, and got trained in the F4D Phantom. Like I say, you know, and I couldn't believe my new office suite, 3 times larger, you know, everything all nice and orderly, good human factors design, ergonomics, a great big attitude gyro that didn't tumble or anything like that. What we had in the was about that big, and of course you needed that because we flew instruments the whole time. I got 175 hours of nighttime in 1 year in that squadron. So the flying was great. I just loved it.
Did you ever land it on a carrier?
This squadron was shore-based. I never did land. One of the things about the Ford, I should have mentioned, you know, when you got slow, on-speed angle of attack, we had angle of attack indicators which were very good to keep you on speed for landing. But the difference between on-speed and stall was only 3 degrees difference. And the first warning of that, as you got slow, was the wing at high angle of attack would blank off the vertical tail, and you'd start to yaw because you didn't have any airflow with the vertical fin. And then, you know, the stall. But I had an excellent cue. Being short, I had the seat all the way up so I could see out. And if I'm coming in, you know, especially at night, and if I couldn't see the runway because the nose was blocking the runway,
that meant I was too slow. Drop the nose a little bit, add a little power to get back on track. So,
Compare the two airplanes. Compare the F4 to the F4D.
I mean, the F4 was a Mach 2, well, you flew the F4.
Yeah.
Mach 2. F4D was barely Mach 1. Very short range. The Phantom had more fuel, and you had somebody in the rear, two-man aircraft, somebody in the rear seat that did all the navigation and target acquisition and lock-on. And we had a good autopilot, you know. I mean, this was, I couldn't believe, you know, what I had there in that airplane. It was such a dramatic improvement in technology and capability and performance. We had true air-to-air capability.
Okay, I think that we got to cut it off. We got another meeting. Next month, it's on the 16th. We're going to learn about Navy aircraft carriers. You can't escape these guys.